And Martin Flaherty is a Leitner Family Professor of Law and founding co-director of the Leitner Center for International Law and Justice and Portland Law School. He is a visiting professor at the Princeton School of Public International Affairs and Barnard College. A distinguished legal scholar, Dr. Flaherty has held teaching positions in China, South Korea, and the United Kingdom, and has clerked for U.S. Supreme Court Justice Byron R. White and Chief Judge John Gibbons. He earned his JD from Columbia Law School, so you're at home here. His MA and Master of Philosophy degrees was distinction from Yale, and his bachelor degree is summa cum laude from Princeton. Martin has led human rights missions worldwide and currently presides over the American Association of the International Commissions of Jurists, serves as a member of the Council of Foreign Relations and advises the UN General Assembly's Sixth Committee. His work on constitutional law, foreign affairs, and human rights appears in leading law reviews, and he is the author of Restoring the Global Judiciary, Why the Supreme Court Should Rule in Foreign Affairs, published by Princeton University Press in 2019. Our next panelist is Nazar Solomakha, and Nazar Solomakha is a Columbia LLM candidate, will be graduating this year, so congratulations, and a legal officer at IPHR. He focuses on investigating war crimes, crimes against humanity, and acts of genocide committed in Ukraine following the Russian full-scale invasion on February 24th, 2022. Nazar is responsible for preparing submissions to the International Criminal Court and scrutinizing sanction violations linked to Russia and Belarus. Drawing on his academic background from the Sorbonne and Columbia, he also contributes to IPHR's corporate accountability initiatives. Combining legal training from Ukraine, France, and the US, Nazar also works on issues of export control at IPHR. And last but not least, Anastasiya Donets. So Anastasiya Donets joined the IPHR team as a legal officer in July 2021 and became the lead of the Ukraine legal team in July 2024. She spearheads strategic litigation and corporate accountability efforts related to the Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine, specializing in monitoring gross human rights violations and atrocity crimes. In collaboration with IPHR's partner Global Diligence, Anastasiya drafts submissions to international judicial and quasi-judicial mechanisms, including the International Criminal Court, and targeted sanctions regimes, as well as cases under universal jurisdiction. She holds an from Harvard Law School and a PhD in international law from Yaroslav Mudry National Law University in Kharkiv. So please give a round of applause. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Anastasiya, for the kind introduction and for hosting us. And I'm very pleased and honored to be here, especially moderating the panel of these two esteemed speakers, of a scholar and a lawyer with decades of experience, and a human rights practitioner with whom I have a pleasure to work. So yeah, let's get to business. First, I wanna begin with asking you both a couple questions about what the situation with Russian aerial attacks in Ukraine is to date. And maybe my first question would be to Nazar, because he works closely with the events taking place in Ukraine every day. So Nazar, could you tell us what's IPHR's assessment of the situation with Russian aerial attacks as of today? What are the statistics you're working on? What are the patterns that you're noticing? What is happening?
Absolutely. Thank you, Anastasiya, and everyone for coming. As we see, as we transition into 2025, unfortunately, Russia is again escalating its attacks on Ukraine, especially on the energy infrastructure of Ukraine. And what we see, that number of aerial missiles and drones which is attacking Ukraine monthly is growing exponentially. And hence the Ukraine ability to shoot down these missiles and drones is decreasing because of geopolitical factors and because of the number of weapons Russia has. if we get back to December last year, so just recently, Russia has fired around 1,500 both drones and rockets on Ukraine in just 1 month. And Ukraine succeeded in shooting down the half of them. Already in January, the number was around 2,600 rockets and drones in a month, and of course, Ukraine shoot down around only 30–40% of those missiles. We are only today, it's 11th of February, and Russia already fired over 1,000 missiles and drones on Ukraine, and it's not the end of the month yet. The Russia is precisely targeting, unlike in the autumn, the gas storage facilities of Ukraine, hence damaging efforts of Ukraine to get this gas from the ground and provide it to the population of Ukraine and also to our neighbors in the West as required by contracts. The attacks, they do not damage itself the storages, but the facilities which allow the instruction of the gas and its transport being damaged basically every week, especially in the Western Ukraine, which significantly undermines not only the safety and energy safety of Ukraine, but also the economy of our country. Also, Russia is damaging, as always, electric generation plants of Ukraine. This has been their typical strategy for almost 2 years right now, and they never stopped with these efforts. Just yesterday, I received from my relatives in Ukraine that we'll have around 6 or 9 hours without electricity per day right now because of these attacks and because of the very cold temperatures in Ukraine right now. Significantly, what we see is that all of these attacks, they are conducted with high precision weapons. We're talking about Kinzhals, we're talking about Iskanders, we're talking about Iranian head drones, which are all of them are extremely precise. Russia positioned their weapon as precise themselves, and Ukrainian authorities also already analyzed this, and this weapon has up to 2–3 meters precision rate. And unfortunately, as we analyzed in our reports, in 2 of our existing reports on Russian missiles and Russian Iranian Shahed drones, and in our upcoming report on the weapon carriers, so the Russian jets, all of these weapons have US-made components. And the majority of the Western-made components in these weapons are the American-made. Russia has been very successful in circumventing sanctions and export controls. There are certain jurisdictions which are extremely popular venue for doing these kind of actions. And the current legislation in the US and the joint actions of Ukraine, Europe, and US has been so far, unfortunately, unsuccessful in preventing this shadow export, these sanctions or conventions as of today. Why I'm saying this? Because first of all, Russia has never depleted its missiles or drones storages. It's producing new missiles and drones monthly, including the jets. Russia produces around 30, for instance, 30 Sukhoi jets annually. And all of these weapons, they contain US chips, which are being somehow brought to Russia and integrated in the Russian weapons. And unfortunately, these specific US-made components, they are crucial parts of Russian weapons. They are some detectors, radars, some kind of missile controls. Without them, as we see, very likely these weapons either would not exist at all, or they would not be as effective, as precise as they are today. We see it as a problem, not of the fault of US companies or fault of US, but basically Russia being very effective in exploiting the loopholes and maybe a bit of passivity of the current things, how the world go. And we seek to explore, and this will be your topic, how can we engage effectively with companies to basically prevent this common strategy of Russia from succeeding further.
Thank you, Nazar. Maybe I would ask one more question before delving into the company's involvement. I wanted to ask you, Professor Flaherty, why this might be counterintuitive, but why are we talking about Russian attacks as an issue at all? Because, there is this saying that the international humanitarian law is agnostic to who started the war, whether it's a war of aggression or a war in which a country defends itself. So why are we talking that Russian attacks are bad? Are they all bad? And what do we mean by saying that they're illegal? What are the legal consequences of these attacks? How can they be classified
Sure.
under international law?
Sure, yes. Well, thank you. And just a couple of preliminary things out of the way. I should, despite my extravagantly Irish last name, I also, to fess up, I'm half Ukrainian on my mother's side. But the Irish are not unfamiliar with being victims of European imperialism themselves. And also, my father spent a year here as a postdoc at the Russian Institute before it was named the Harriman Institute, right after World War II when he got out of the Navy. So to answer your question, the relevant law is the international humanitarian law of armed conflict, otherwise known colloquially as the laws of war, which divides into two categories. One is jus ad bellum, and the other is jus in bello. Jus ad bellum is roughly translated into the law against war, and that's controlled by essentially the UN Charter. And so, one can think of no more extravagant violation of jus ad bellum rules than the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which violates Article 2.4 of the UN Charter. One mechanism to deal with that, unfortunately, is the Security Council. And they're both legal, but more obviously structural problems with the Security Council in exercising its powers under Chapter 7, Article 42, because of the Russian veto and likely a PRC veto as well. But as you say, Anastasiya, whether an act of aggression has been committed, and just in 2006, an addition or amendment to the Statute of Rome. So these are the violations of the laws of war, but the laws of war crimes constitute one of several elements of international criminal law. And that's controlled by the Rome Statute of the ICC. And in 2006, that statute took on, or what the parties added to that beyond genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, was the crime of aggression. Now, but as you say, whether a war is legitimately started or armed conflict is legitimately started or not has nothing to do with how it is fought, and that's jus in bello. And that is largely controlled by the 4 Geneva Conventions of 1949, as well as the 2 protocols to the Geneva Conventions in 1977, but beyond that by the customary laws of war. So these principles actually cover states that haven't formally become state parties to those treaties. And there are 4 basic principles with regard to how to fight a war. Those 4 principles are necessity, cruelty or humanity, proportionality, and discrimination. Necessity is that the use of force during a war has some military goal, or valid military goal or necessity. So demoralizing a civilian population, is not a valid, goal. So that gets to the notion of taking out the electrical grid, for example. The second principle is humanity or cruelty, which is to say that the weapons used do not create or exact undue pain. So the classic example there is going to be gas. That's one of the reasons. In fact, poison gas, one of the reasons it is one of the first things outlawed after World War I is it violates many of these principles, but that's one. 2 others are proportionality, so that the force used to obtain the military goal is proportional to that goal. So you can't destroy a whole province because, there is one machine gun nest somewhere. And then finally, discrimination, that's the most important one. Discrimination is the duty to take reasonable efforts to discriminate between combatants and non-combatants, which of course is going to be probably the most relevant one to what Russia's doing in Ukraine. And that applies both to people and to property. And so the deliberate targeting of either civilian areas or civilian property and civilian facilities is a flagrant violation of use and bellow laws of war. So that's a quick run through of that.
Right. Well, thank you very much. I think we could have a whole another event on use ad bellum and how Security Council now is at a deadlock. And
Right,
it seems
right.
like how can we use it in the future,
Right.
taking where it is now. And thank you so much for a quick recap of an IHL course for us. It was very, very useful for us to understand why what is happening in Ukraine on a daily basis constitutes thousands of potential war crimes. And Nazar, my next question is to you and is about that. Would you tell us more? You mentioned 2 reports that IPHR has issued on Russian aerial attacks with the use of precise missiles and with drones. Could you tell us more about these reports? How does IPHR gather evidence of Russian aerial attacks, and how does it decide that these attacks constitute potential war crimes or arguably crimes against humanity? And what do have Western, including US technology, what do they have? How are they connected to these attacks?
Absolutely. Returning to Professor, I wish a same quick recap of IHL would be done to Russians. At least some time, adapt with it, be useful.
Yeah.
As for the 2 reports, yeah, we've been collaborating also with NATO on doing these 2 reports. Ukrainian organization specifically effective, very effective in technicalities and of components of weapons, because it's very closely cooperates with the Ukrainian government and also Ukrainian intelligence. What we do as a PHR, as we have an amazing field and OSINT team trained to specifically analyze impact sites, so whether a missile or a drone hit, how the place look like, all the basically technicalities, so how it's done. I'm not going deeply in that, and also working with traumatized victims. So what we do is the work is twofold. First, we send our field team. Upon we analyze a specific attack with our legal team and OSINT team. OSINT team does open source investigation, so it looks at the place which was hit, for instance, by a missile through aerial photos, through Google Maps. It analyzes presence of any potential military targets nearby. Of course, we never can be sure, because it's a conflict, but there is, of course, a lot of open source information. It then searches and monitors Ukrainian media, social media. It monitors Russian media, of course, what Russia says about these attacks, not to say that we believe those Russian statements, but we always want to know how Russia positioned those statements. Just an example here, when Russia attacked hospital in Mariupol in 2022, it positioned it as the victims of these hospitals were paid actors by Ukraine, which is, of course, a blatant and I'm sorry, stupid lie. But it provides how Russia tries to conceal its actions. So after those analysis is done, it usually takes weeks to do it for a few potential IHL or violations. We send our field team there, which is people trained in analyzing weapons parts, impact sites, trained in engaging with victims, and usually there is a psychologist with them who also help us to correctly interview and engage with victims of the attacks. After that is done, after all the information is gathered, photo, video information, after we talk with, if it's possible, with the prosecutors team, we talked with Ukrainian authorities. After that, we basically, in our legal team, we analyze this information and engage with NACO, right, to understand the technicalities of the components, the weapon parts. And what we were surprised to see is that, as I said during the first question, that majority of these weapons have an unexpected amount of Western weapons, more Western components, and most of these components they are of dual-use nature, but still the fact that these components, and as it's confirmed by NACO and as it's confirmed by the Ukrainian authorities, you can even Google that. There is a specific resource for Russian weapon which contains Western components. We'll show it after this event. What you will see is that the amount of these components is crucial to the very modern Russian weapons right now. So what we came to the conclusion, and these two reports, that first in Shahed drones, which first was produced in Iran, but right now produced in Alabuga, which is a distant region in Russia, they still contain Western-made components, even as of today. And we keep seeing Shahed attacking Ukraine on a daily basis. So it's a very, I would say, deadly and unfortunately popular weapon. And in the missile report, what we find out is that Russia extremely modern and precise, high precision weapon is capable to do that precision significantly in part because of the Western-made components. And analyzing how and why those components are getting into Russia, despite all the sanctions or the export controls, is what really puzzles us right now, and why there is still nothing can be effectively done about that, even though all of the Western companies are required to have compliance, and they have compliance. So I think it goes back to what we can do about it on the level of engagement with companies, or on the level of reforming our legislation, for instance, in the US.
Thank you, Nazar. Thank you for leading us through the everyday IPHR's work in documenting potential Russian war crimes. To put it very simply, we know that potential war crimes are taking place in Ukraine. We also know that the missiles and drones and weapon carriers used for this attack contain Western tech, including the US tech. What we don't know is why, despite 3 years of sweeping sanctions, unprecedented sanctions, spearheaded by the US, but also joined by Canada, Japan, EU, all the countries with advanced technologies, all these countries closed their markets for Russia. So there is no direct trade between Russia and these countries, including between Russia and the US. So my next question is to Professor Flaherty. I understand there probably is no simple answer to this, but could you tell us more about what these sanctions and export controls are? When we talk about sanctions and export controls, it's kind of, again, it's kind of intuitive. If there is a country waging an aggressive war, you should probably not support it in any way, including by supplying it weapons or weapon components. But how does it work inside the US, since the US was the main driving force behind this sweeping sanction regime? What does this sanction and export control regime means? And why is it not effective enough to completely stop the flow of Western tech to Russia?
So you're right. The short answer is it's complicated.
Yeah, it's a good legal answer.
Right. And the longer answer is actually maybe beyond the law, which is in the sense of enforcement, problems of whatever is there. But to speak to the law, just to acknowledge the whatever you want to call them, the elephant in the room, what is going to really determine the will of the executive branch and even the will of Congress when it comes to these issues is going to be the new president. And what his position, we before the election pretty much thought we knew exactly what his position was going to be. It seems to be a little less clear now. But if the success of a sanctions regime or even a regime that goes beyond sanctions is going to depend on the will of the President of the United States, there's going to be reasons not to be too hopeful for the next 4 years. That out of the way, what is the toolkit and what is the mechanisms? Well, one is there are actually, an array, as you say, of sanctions. I was got this fact sheet from the State Department, and the thing is, most of the sanctions, I think the vast majority of sanctions are actually against foreign companies, not US companies. And that's a problem. And I don't know, but I suspect that's the same in the EU. So it is easy to sanction companies in Russia. It's easy to sanction Iranian companies. It's easy to sanction, although much harder to track, Chinese companies. But there don't appear to me to be at this point anything like the robust sanctions, at least on paper, against foreign companies and Russian companies in particular, as there are against US companies. That said, can either the Congress or the executive branch issue sanctions against US companies in this regard? And the short answer is yes. In fact, with regard to sanctions themselves, you don't necessarily even need new legislation. There's something called the IEEPA, the International Executive Emergency Powers Act, which is a vast delegation of authority to the president to take any steps that the president deems necessary regarding freezing assets, regarding trade sanctions, etc., whenever the president deems that the nation's security is at interest, or when the nation is facing a national security threat. And so, again, while you may need new legislation for certain other things, it seems like the tools are there ready to be used to expand sanctions regime against US corporations, but it doesn't seem to have, and I could be wrong about this, but it doesn't seem to be anything like comparable to what's going on in the sanctions regime against foreign corporations. The one other thing that is a possible measure is not sanctions per se, but investment in companies that do, have their goods, wind up in these Russian weapons. So there's something called CFIUS. So CFIUS is generally a regime that is used to vet foreign investment in the United States when national security is an interest. But one thing that the Congress did under the previous administration undertook was something called reverse CFIUS. So that is to limit investment by US corporations into companies that then might engage in supplying weapons in such a way that threatens the national security of the United States. And so if one problem is there's US investment that is facilitating the Western technology appearing in Russian missiles, perhaps one way to cut it off is through a reverse CFIUS. So far, however, the reverse CFIUS regime has been only applied to China and not to Russia. So again, that would be a matter of executive, foreign policy and political will. But those are at least two options. And then, as I say, beyond what these options, even when these options are undertaken, the question of monitoring becomes, incredibly difficult. And that's a whole nother component.
Thank you very much. This actually is a perfect transition to my next question, because as far as I understand, the problem with export controls, or like the ratio behind export controls and sanctions, is that the US in this case, because we're talking about US policies, it doesn't want its tech appearing in the countries in its adversaries, including Russia and China. And actually, this fall there was a very interesting Congress hearing where four biggest U.S. tech producers were testifying before the Congress, and the Congress members were grilling them about how it happened so that their components end up in Russian weapons. And it was just fascinating to see these people who make billions of dollars sweating and trying to
Yeah.
explain what's going on. But the kind of like the general conclusion that we made from it, that these companies are really trying to comply with export controls, and they don't want their tech to end up in Russia or China, because this is what makes this tech valuable. It's unique, and they don't want it in the adversary's hands. So I think my next question is to you, Nazar, and Professor Flaherty mentioned it a little bit, that US already sees China as a threat in terms of the war of technology, if I can put it this way. So could you tell us more about how does the US tech get into Russia according to our partners' findings? You call them NACO. I will just give a name. They're amazing, and I think you should check out their work. They're called Independent Anti-Corruption Commission in English, and they are doing some exceptional work on tracing the components, because they have access to the actual components. They establish what the components are. They track the components to specific companies, and then they are trying to track how these components got into the Russian weapons from Germany or Switzerland or Japan or the US. So I guess, long story short, my question is, according to these findings, how does US tech and other Western tech get into Russia? And how can we stop it?
Sure. And I would like to suggest here like a framework in which we analyze this question. And I would like to take a step back and say that this is not a local problem for Ukraine, because all of the modern Russian, very effective, high-precision weapon, which been deadly in Ukraine for 3 years, which killed thousands of civilians, and we're not talking even about the military losses. It's been effective so with the US produced weapons. So I'd like just to approach this question as a national threat also to the US, because Russia, which is obviously adversary to US, has been very effective in stealing, I would say stealing, the results of the American bright minds and integrating them in the Russian weapons and doing its aggressive war in Ukraine. And we don't know whether it will stop in Ukraine, right? So coming back to your question, how does American components result in Russian Iskanders or Russian Shahed drones? Short question is, they effectively use jurisdictions, usually neighboring jurisdictions or jurisdictions in the Southeast Asia as hubs for acquiring weapons, acquiring components en masse, and then basically sending them to Russia. Also, Russia is, as we see, very successful using China, because to control anything which goes on in China is impossible. And because of the Russian border with China, it's able to get any components which are produced on the American factories in China to Russia. And this is, again, in line with the current administration efforts to bring production back to the US, or at least limit its production in China. What you can see from the media, that Russia established fake companies, shell companies in these jurisdictions in Eastern Europe, in Asia, in Southeast Asia, in Arab region, and they basically do it very fast. Even if one company is being detected as triggering red flags of compliance of some company, they open a new company. They have tons of cash, which is impossible to trace. this jurisdiction doesn't require this transparency reporting, and so this is a systematic problem. It's impossible to close 10 companies today and not expect 20 companies to emerge tomorrow in the same jurisdiction or another jurisdiction. So what Russia does, it exploits these loopholes of, I would say, the US and basically the Western compliance in the companies not addressing and adequately reacting to what is going on in the other jurisdictions which are not directly involved in the conflict in Ukraine. There is so far no direct mechanism to react to that. However, if we look at the statistic, the statistic is open. The US and the European export to some of the countries, I would not name them, but it grows exponentially from 2022, and in some of them it just stabilized, in some of them it's growing, but it's not really hard to see where US and Europe reintegrated in export, and why somehow Kazakhstan is exporting 10 times of some product as it did in 2022. How to approach this? I think it comes back to the internal legislation and engaging with companies, because to resolve it simply by sanctions, so far we can recognize it's been ineffective, and the Ukrainian people have been dying, and they're dying today. Today we have also missiles attack at night with weapons which contain likely US-made components.
Thank you, Nazar. Yeah, I guess there is not an easy answer to a question. It's kind of like a cat and mouse game, like who is faster. There is new legislation and new regulations to stop the flow, and then Russia and its allies come up with ways to circumvent this regulation. So it's kind of a question, if I can get philosophical, of how do you fight lawlessness with law, and with how do you how can you work against a country that employs illegal methods of acquiring goods? And I think my first, I guess as a lawyer myself, my first idea is we should go to court and sue someone. But my next question is to you, Professor Flaherty. Do you think that's a good approach? Is it litigation? Is it changes to policy? Is it advocacy? What can be?
Yeah, I think, well, 3 points, right? One is actually much of what I do done in the last 5-10 years is human rights and People's Republic of China, right? And so, for example, the issue of Western technology winding up in the hands of a major autocratic state is not a new one. Much, or at least a significant portion of the surveillance technology in places like Xinjiang and Tibet, at least, initially were Western, so that's going the inflow, which is very sort of parallel. And also sustaining is export. So there is to combat the crimes against humanity and possible genocide against Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang, Congress passed the Uyghur Free Labor Act, which is puts a presumption that goods exported from Xinjiang to the United States are made with slave labor, and they have to prove that they're not. But there are all sorts of ways that the PRC regime has been able to get around that. One is sending these goods to neighboring states in Central and Southeast Asia, or even to just other parts of China. So it doesn't surprise me at all. In fact, I would have expected that a key player in the transfer of Western technology into Russia is going to be the PRC and its immediate allies. And it is very, very difficult to kind of put, an end to that. But but there are ways to at least take steps. And so there are two, one soft and one more hard-nosed litigation. The softer one is to take advantage of the still ongoing movement in the United Nations of business and human rights. And there, the key document still is something that's about 15 years old, I think, at this point, which is the UN Basic Guidelines on Business and Human Rights, which was drafted by a Harvard professor, John Ruggie, and adopted by the Human Rights Council. And it's an interesting document because it took a different approach, which I think is especially on point here, which is that corporations pledge not to to abide by human rights, not to aid and abet human rights violations. But much more importantly, it tries to give detailed guidelines as to how corporations can avoid that. And it's essentially versions of due diligence and following your supply chain, which is very much on point here. So, a sort of less confrontational way to deal with at least some corporations, and one argument you can make is both US national security and not wanting to get dragged in front of congressional committees, is to lobby them and work with them in their various business NGOs, one led by at NYU, led by a former Secretary of State for Assistant Secretary of State for Human Rights under President Obama, and engage corporations to take a more aggressive role into trying to follow their supply chains. They get good publicity out of it. They get less scrutiny from Congress, et cetera. So that is kind of the more friendly engagement approach. Again, one can't put ultimate hope in that, but to the extent it ameliorates the problem to any extent is going to be a win. With regard to the hard-nosed approach, there is something that is kind of on life support, but I think oddly enough in this situation is still feasible. So there's something called, and some of you might have heard of this, the Alien Tort Statute. And the Alien Tort Statute is something that was passed by the first Congress, and it enables aliens to go to US federal court and bring suits against individuals and possibly domestic corporations for violating international law, including international human rights law. The statute lay dormant for 200 years until the early 80s, when it began to be used by victims of human rights abuses against their torturers, against those who killed their family members, et cetera, in the US. Now, the Supreme Court, and I don't know how much into the legal weeds yet, but the Supreme Court has vastly constricted the use of this as a device. For about 20 years, it was very effective. The reason I think the Supreme Court started to draw back on it was precisely because litigants started suing corporations for aiding and abetting state human rights violations. And corporations get better law firms than, say, Paraguayan colonels who engage in torture, right? Nonetheless, there's still a window for something like this. So if it could be shown that a corporation either knowingly or perhaps, and this would be much tougher, unknowingly, US corporation was responsible for having components in Russian missiles that in turn were used by Russia to violate international humanitarian law and international criminal law, then there is this small window in which under current Supreme Court doctrine that, those lawsuits could go forward. Chances are may not be successful, but it would generate a lot of negative publicity for corporations that were particularly recalcitrant in monitoring their supply chains, and might provide at least some degree of more general publicity on this issue. What would you need to do it? You need somebody who was, a Ukrainian victim of this. They wouldn't have to be living in the United States, but they could bring the suit here. And you'd need some sort of organization that would be willing to do it pro bono. And there are several, but that would be a kind of much more kind of in-your-face approach.
Right. I would just add that you probably also need someone who would be ready to do it for tens of years, because
Yes, it takes forever. Yeah.
it takes forever, and then sometimes it results in settlements, which is probably not the worst option for
Yeah.
survivors and victims.
Right,
But thank you very much for this overview, and I think, well, my next question and probably the last question would be to Nazar about how do human rights defenders approach this issue, both IPHR and IPHR's partners? What strategies did they consider? Did they consider the two that Professor Flaherty mentioned? And what is IPHR's experience with dealing with this issue?
Sure. So far, we tried to engage with companies in a dialogue. For instance, we're currently producing a report on the carriers of the Russian weapons, which basically Russian jets. It's still being made, but we've already been communicating with some of the companies. Some of them been very open to engage with us. They opened internal investigations. They really tried, we saw they would face desire to stop what's going on and truly understand how the components are getting into Russia. And this has been some of the experience will be very positive for us. For instance, our program director received calls from CEOs of these companies and talking with them, what can we do inside the company to investigate this effectively, because it's not obviously not been done effectively so far. Some of the other companies been, I would say, very aggressive defensive. They threatened lawsuits, saying that they're going to tear us apart, every one of us. But that's expectable. So that didn't come as a surprise to us. And this is not only comes with IPHR, but other human rights organizations experience, I would say, suggest the same strategies of companies once they've been approached with issues similar to this one. As for litigation, we approached and researched some litigation strategies in US and also in Europe, in some of the European jurisdictions. So far, we are working with some law firms in Europe to understand how can we approach these issues effectively. But I would say the cornerstone of our approach is to not to litigate, because it takes time, and I would suggest in Ukraine we don't have a luxury of time, because every day as we would litigate and as lawyers would suggest arguments and think how smart they are, the usual people, the folks in Ukraine would continue to die, get injured. So what we want to do is a real effect. We want to have a real effect on what's going on right now, and we see that that is possible in engaging with companies, is talking to them and demonstrating the root of the issues, of the problems, and also engaging with stakeholders, Brussels, in Washington, highlighting, spotlighting this problem and understanding how we all can work together to stop this and to both improve the US national security and also save innocent lives in Ukraine. Thank you all for coming today.
Thank you, Nazar. And the moderated part of the discussion is over. And I would love to hear some questions from the audience if you have any.
Yes, you've all touched on this a little bit, but the companies, US companies whose components are lining up in Russian missiles and other weapons, I mean, what are they intentionally? I mean, this is a broad question, but are they intentionally allowing the things, or they just can't control it? I mean, you've touched on a little bit. I'm just trying to, like, is there more that could be done from a public standpoint, for example, to pressure those companies that may not be taking it seriously enough, or think that the profit motive involved outweighs the moral and humanitarian, motivation?
I'll respond to this question. The US is a primary producer of some components, specifically of chips in the world. So, and the amount of the components, the chips which are produced in the US is counted in trillions annually. So how we see it is that majority of companies simply do not know how to control the inflow of the components outside the US because of Russian very effectively using other jurisdictions and shallow companies to buy those components and get them to Russia. To say whether they do it intentionally, it's a long shot, and I cannot say it right now. But what we can all agree on is that all of the companies can do the work more effectively, because the issue has been existing for 3 years right now. We've seen congressional hearings, we've seen constant communication from the Ukrainian government on these issues. And what can you agree on is that the effort right now, which the US corporate world has, is definitely not enough to prevent people from dying.
And the only thing I'd add, and another component I think could be ongoing and maybe even heightened, is congressional oversight. Because, and again, there is the elephant in the room, Trump could snap his fingers and those Republicans who are concerned about this will pull back. But unless and until that happens, there are leading Republicans who are concerned about this. I think Lindsey Graham is one, some others. And there's also one recently elected Democrat who I've mentioned, who I think is worth reaching out to with regard to this issue. You probably remember Alexander Vindman, who was the guy who, with the phone call, the perfect phone call from Trump to Zelensky. His brother also, and both is his brother Eugene Vindman. They're both Ukrainian, twins. They're twins, both military. And what Eugene Vindman spent the last 3 or 4 years doing was he was seconded, I think, either by the Department of Defense or the Department of Justice or both, to do some of this kind of stuff that Nazar's organization is, to compile evidence of war crimes in Ukraine. And he has just this fall been elected to Congress. And I think he could be a leading, pressure point, someone who could really bring congressional pressure to bear, because I think he would be particularly knowledgeable about this issue and would very much care about it. And work with people like Lindsey Graham and others also.
Any more questions? Yes.
A little bit more on the south side, but and I was late, so I apologize. I missed the contact. But if you were talking to somebody who was in a position to be involved and do something about this, but didn't perhaps care, what argument would you make, or more argument would you make to draw it in, kind of over their eyes, other than just saying we should do this?
Sorry, I would repeat this question. I would repeat it for our online audience because the mic is here. So just, you will just hear this question again. So if you met someone who could do something about the situation, who had this kind of influence of stopping the flow of Western tech into Russia, but wasn't really interested in doing that, how would you possibly persuade them? Is that? Yeah.
Well, I think there is a spectrum of arguments, right, which run from self-interest to moral responsibility, right? And so, at one end of the spectrum is going to be just for an American citizen, right, who is not concerned about, is not a corporate executive in this. I think one argument from the point of view of self-interest is this undermines the national security of the United States, right? If I am then addressing a corporate official of the type we're talking about, the kind of cudgel I would wave over them is bad publicity, right? Then moving, sort of further down, right, it is legal obligations. Do you want to be involved in the same sorts of international crimes that were the subject of Nuremberg and Tokyo, right? Which we've just been talking about. And then finally, appealing to, as Lincoln would say, the better angels of their nature, just this is terrible to facilitate, and think of the suffering of the Ukrainian civilians. So.
I just wanted to add to this. You mentioned Nuremberg and Tokyo, and I actually discovered just last year when I was doing my program in international criminal law that there were Nuremberg trials on industrialists, on the companies that actually made this Nazi war machine go, which I never knew about. But spoiler, they were not very effective. They failed to establish corporate accountability for war crimes, which is unfortunate. It's kind of like not a great beginning for corporate accountability.
Right. And that's why ironically, the one kind of exception to that for a while, although the Supreme Court has limited this a little, was there was no criminal liability in US law that was effective, but the civil liability under this ATS case
Right.
was like this one window
Yeah.
curtailed, but ironically enough, what the Supreme Court would still allow, I think, would be a suit against a domestic corporation for crimes, war crimes or crimes against humanity, even if they didn't take place on US soil, because it was a US defendant.
Yeah, let's hope that this window does not close.
Right.
And
Yeah.
we still can.
Right.
use it. Any more questions?
So my question, first of all, thank you so much for this wonderful panel. That was extremely interesting and I learned a lot of things I never thought even about. So you mentioned many times that it's extremely difficult to sanction individual companies because these individual companies can cease to exist and new companies are opened and, yeah, it's difficult and I understand why. Is it even a thing in international law to sanction the whole industries, even like dual purpose industries? Or anyone who is dealing with like, let's say, imports from Kazakhstan to Russia or something along those lines?
I will just repeat this question for our online listeners. So it's hard to sanction specific companies, international companies, companies abroad that are aiding and abetting Russian war crimes. But could it be done through sanctioning the whole industry, for example, sanctioning the whole dual use objects industry instead of sanctioning specific companies?
Well, the precedent I can think of is the Uyghur Forced Labor Act, right? Because it's not about specific companies. It's not even about specific industry sectors. It is just that if one can establish that a good is being exported from Xinjiang, then the law raises a presumption that it has been made with forced labor and cannot, be imported into the United States. And then the burden shifts to the importer to prove that it was not made with forced labor or slave labor. So, there's an example of a kind of an across the board approach. Unfortunately, as I indicated, there have been a number of ways that the PRC has gotten around that. You sell goods and it's largely cotton, but some other, goods made with Xinjiang cotton to Thailand or Vietnam, and then it gets re-exported. It's hard to trace that. Or you just sell it internally within China and sell it to, a company in Shenzhen, right, in Guangdong province, and then that gets imported. So it's not going to be subject to the same strictures. So there are problems with it, but in theory, it is, Congress has already gone one step beyond even what you suggest, right? Which is not just an industry sector, but, goods coming from an entire region.
There is also a federal direct product rule, which basically allows to sanction any product which contains significant amount of US tech or was produced with US tech. And it's been like revitalized after the Russian forced invasion, but I don't think it is what was so effective so far.
And another problem, by the way, I just got notice of this today or yesterday. This is a little not directly on point, but I think it would have an influence. So the United States has something called the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which penalizes US corporate officials who try to bribe officials from states abroad. And apparently the president has just suspended the operation of that. So to the extent, there might be foreign companies who want other states to turn a blind eye on this issue. It's going to be that much easier to kind of grease those officials' palms.
Thank you. Anyone, please?
But, is there another angle on stopping the flow of the components, which would be transportation? We know, for example, in oil tankers, there's what is it called, the shadow fleet that Russia has, if I'm using the term right. In that case, exports, of course, from Russia oil. but so again, back to the weapon components, is there some way to intervene or interfere with the transportation into Russia through these third countries and other jurisdictions?
I will just repeat for the audience. So is there a way to stop the components flow, not from the point of view, as far as I understand, not from the point of view of what you regulate, but from the point of view of how you regulate the transportation and how closely you monitor it, I guess, because it's been, to your point about oil, it's been oil sanctions and gas sanctions have been extremely effective compared to sanctions and export controls trying to stop the flow of tech. So would something like this be done in this sphere?
Yeah, I think the first issue with tankers is that these are very specific physical objects, and we know what they do and where they're doing it, and we know their trade routes. So with tankers, we know basically it's very easy to track tankers, even though they change the ports of where they register, they change the tankers and stuff, but it's something tangible and countable, which is possible to do, and even that take like almost 3 years to do. And we still have a question whether the sanctions will be extended after they are over. As for the goods like chips, which are very small, basically it's impossible to count them. We have twofold problem. First one is some of those chips being produced outside the US by American companies. We're talking about like China. We have a lot of American factories in China, and to control anything inside China, not possible, right? Second is that how can we understand whether a specific part of the trade is going to benefit Russia and Russian military complex if this part of trade is indistinguishable from the overall trade with a specific country jurisdiction. That is a very hard thing to do because it's very highly discriminatory and would violate a lot of trade laws. Even though right now, yes, and trade law is not what it's most ever seen. Yeah. So
They're ready to be creative.
yeah,
Right.
ready to be creative.
Yeah.
This, I would say, it's a more political decision, and pushing jurisdictions which been directly benefiting from the sanctions and conventions would be more effective and likely would not involve violation of the laws. And second one is revitalization of the rules inside the US, directly punishing corporations which benefit from those potential violations, and maybe FDCPR rule, which I mentioned, which would not allow corporations to export components to I would say designated high-risk jurisdictions if they contain investment components. I think you may not agree, but it's more on a political side right now.
Yeah, and I think another problem with one solution is it would be a catch-22. So if you are aware that there is a state being an intermediary, to that moves these goods to Russia, the catch-22 and what you would want to do then is the United States would work with authorities from that state to prevent that from happening. The catch-22 is the leaders of that state are probably complicit in the fact that it's going through. And what makes that catch-22 even larger is to the extent that states like China are involved. Well, through initiatives like the Belt and Road, and China's general kind of going out policy under Xi Jinping, there are going to be a lot of states in the region, particularly Central Asia, that are going to be beholden to China's aid and China's investment, and not very much open to the United States, even if there was the political will to try to work to keep these goods from going over their borders into Russia. Yeah, it's a good way.
What is your take on the increasing number of speculations of the potential ceasefire between Russia and Ukraine? And if there is a ceasefire, do you think the West will keep or weaken sanctions against Russia? And more broadly, is there any expiration date for global sanctions regimes against countries?
Thank you. I was waiting for someone to ask this question. Thank you for asking it. I will repeat it for everyone. So, what is your take on the news and rumors about a potential ceasefire, and how, in your opinion, that would influence Western sanctions, whether they will be lifted? If yes, I'm adding for myself, if yes, then when? Will it be like step by step, or all sanctions lifted at once? And the last part of your question was, I think, is there an expiration date on the current sanction regime?
Like in general for sanctions regimes, like can sanctions against Russia stay for decades?
Right. Yeah, so is there an expiration regime for sanctions, or they can just, Russia can be sanctioned forever?
Well, I'm interested in the views of Ukrainians on the ceasefire point first before I speak.
All people in Ukraine hope for peace. All people of Ukraine want the end of conflict. This is natural. What means is what you imply by the end of conflict, what you imply by peace. Because in the dictionary of Russians and Ukrainians, unfortunately, these things have very different definitions. What is peace for Russia, as we just take it from the Russian rhetoric of Putin, is likely a cease to existence of Ukrainians' independence or effective independence. That being said, all of Ukrainians want a long-lasting peace, which will secure independence and ability of Ukraine to defend itself, and being given a helping hand, not a formal helping hand, but a true helping hand if the conflict arises once again, ever. This has been the rhetoric and official position of the Ukrainian government. I share these sentiments. How this peace will be achieved, when it will be achieved, as far as the pure speculation, nothing can be said about that. The events unfolding very unexpectedly or expectedly, whichever. Everyone can say different things, but they're unfolding right now, and let's see how it goes further. What I would encourage is that the peace for Ukraine should not be just a formal word of peace, but a complex agreement which will secure Ukraine an independent state in the map of Europe.
For me, well, so let me preface my remarks by saying that what I'm about to say is easy for me to say because I am not ducking bombs and drones in Ukraine, nor do I have relatives, as far as I know, who are still there doing it. That said, I tend to be persuaded by the views of Timothy Snyder on this. And one is that Putin cannot be rewarded for violating the core ideas of the post-World War II order. And that includes, first of all, the prohibition against invading another country. And secondly, the prohibition against engaging in crimes against humanity and genocide. And for all its faults, those were two general achievements of the post-World War II order. And to, for example, enable Putin to maintain control of eastern, Ukraine or Crimea is, just unacceptable. Snyder says Ukraine and Ukrainians are the ones who are basically fighting to preserve the post-World War II order on behalf of everybody else. And it's kind of a scandal that Ukraine hasn't gotten more support than it has. The other factor there is, given that what Putin wants to do is make Imperial Russia great again, and has not adhered to virtually any of his, international commitments, you know, in the great tradition of previous autocrats in the region. There is very little reason to believe that he will adhere to any internet, you know, any peace settlement, and that will violate it as soon as he sees the opportunity that he can get away with it. That said, if it was, you know, the will of the Ukrainian people and of, you know, the president to negotiate some ceasefire, you know, I think that what they would want, and I think, you know, the fallback position is that Ukraine would get ironclad guarantees of its continued existence. And I think that at a minimum, that would consist of immediate admission to NATO and immediate admission to the European Union. So.
Any more questions? Okay, then I wanted to maybe give the floor for the last remarks, if you have any. It seems like we've covered a lot today, so do you have anything else to say to the audience before we go today?
I'll probably end with that ringing ode to Ukrainian independence.
That sounds really good. Thank you so much. I wanted to thank again to the Harriman Institute for hosting this event and for all your incredible work in Ukraine. I wanted to thank Professor Flaherty for sharing with us his incredible expertise. It's been a pleasure, and I'm so glad that people online were able to watch it and they will be able to return to it whenever they want. I wanted to thank my colleague Nazar, who worked so hard to bring accountability for the Russian crimes against Ukraine, and for all of you for your excellent question and for your interest in this topic. Thank you.
Thank you. Great. I learned a lot.
It was, especially for your remarks, just.
Right in the front.
No, I mean, and it's, I saw Snyder at the Council on Foreign Relations, and he was more eloquent than that, but yeah, he's
Thank you
great.
so much for this wonderful event.
Thank
It was
you.
wonderful. We learned a lot, all of us.
Yeah. Well, one thing that's been great is that, you know, I've noticed how the Harriman Institute has been, you know, really on top of the Ukraine issue. You know, it would be very easy to
Well, the other thing that.
be so kind of Russia oriented.
Yeah, for the last several years, we had Ukrainian programs,
Yeah.
so we have scholars who are associated with exclusively with Ukrainian program, like myself.
That's great, yeah.
Yeah, so I'm very glad that it's happening. And yeah, if you have any other ideas for events, please do not hesitate to reach out to me.
Sounds good.
Yeah, and we will have more events about
Thank you.
Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, no, not at all.
I just wanted to introduce myself.
That's great.
I'm Erin.
Erin, nice to meet you.
Wonderful.
Yeah, with you.
There might be a few
Yeah,
years.
it's a great pleasure.
Yeah.
Perhaps help for the US.
Happy to make this happen.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Medals for, you know,
Yeah, she's originally from Harkiv.
Wonderful to meet you.